All right, everybody, back to the Ligon Duncan thing. I did see that Cross Politic decided to respond to Ligon Duncan's, stuff here, and I really want to watch that, but I don't want to watch it before I do mine because I don't want it to flavor my my thoughts. But who knows? I might end up doing it anyway. But in any case, we're gonna get back to it. They're gonna move into a section about Tim Keller's legacy. If you didn't watch yesterday's video about Andrew Klavan, I'm going to put it on the Fight Laugh Feast podcast feed as well. I think it all ties into this stuff, in my opinion. At least I tried to tie it in. So go ahead and give it a watch. That was very interesting. Let's begin.
Kathy Keller, our brother Tim Keller has gone to be with the Lord. Man, what a loss. Praise God for all the fruit that his ministry has borne. You don't have to agree with him about everything to appreciate his ministry. Colin Hansen's biography was superb, very useful in understanding why Tim did a lot of what he did.
Let me just make my comments here on Tim Keller before we get into this. So, have I even talked about Tim Keller on the channel? I don't know. I don't know if I have or not. But Tim Keller's obviously a huge force in evangelicalism. People, rip off Tim Keller all the time. People want to be like Tim Keller. They want to preach like Tim Keller, and all of that kind of thing. And there's a lot of positive in Tim Keller's work. There's just no question about it. Towards the end of his life, though, and really, this was not necessarily just towards the end of his life, but it got more open and more crazy towards the end of his life. A lot of negative fruit. A lot of negative stuff. Especially in the social and the political sphere, he just was no bueno in that stuff. You know what I mean? So this is not to say that everything he ever did was bad and that and all of that, but I really do wonder, in the grand scheme of things, if he was a net negative or net positive. So I'm not that hot on Tim Keller. I used to go to Tim Keller's church. That's what the first church I went to as an adult. And his book, The Prodigal God, which, if I went back and read it, I'm sure I'd find lots of stuff I disagree with. But that book was instrumental in my salvation as well. That the way he unpacked, and I'm using, Big Eva terms because that way hopefully everyone can understand. The way he unpacked the prodigal son story is very helpful. Well, at least it was to me. And it doesn't mean that you should go back and read that book, The Prodigal God. He's trying to be too cute. I hate when people try to be too cute. You know what I mean? Like the title, The Prodigal God. Get out of here with that. Anyway, yeah, that's one of his biggest net negatives. He led the charge of trying to be too cute. I don't like that. Anyway, but yeah, I'm glad that God used that book despite its flaws to help awaken my soul. And so. Yeah, I mean, that's the truth. That's the truth about Tim Keller. He had a huge impact on evangelicalism, and some of it was good, and some of it was bad, and some of it was really good, and some of it was really bad. I don't think there's any question about that. So it's a mixed bag. He was horrible on the woke church stuff. There's just no question about it. Horrible on politics. He's a registered Democrat. I mean, that's just... and then he was one of these guys, too. I mean, and Ligon Duncan, in this way, is a disciple of Tim Keller's. He's one of these guys, too, that he thinks he can get away with, lying about people if he doesn't name them. And this is a core tenet of Big Eva. What I'm thinking about doing is coming up with, a list, like a guidebook for Big Eva's deception, how they deceive people. Because Big Eva deceives people. Ligon Duncan deceives people. And I think that Tim Keller deceived people. One of the best ways that one of the primary ways that they do this is they lie about people without naming them. And they'll never, ever admit that they were talking about someone specific. And that way, they think they can get away with that. They think they're fooling people, right? Because you can never really call them on that lie because you never really said it was about X, Y, Z. You just kind of put this general kind of truism out there that it's true, but it's not true when applied to the person you're talking about. But they don't name him, so that's how they deceive people. That's one way they deceive people. And Tim Keller was the king of that. The king of that. And no matter who called him out on it, he would never admit it. And sometimes he would try to be too cute, and the example got too specific. Like, he put a tweet out, And it was so specific that there's only one possible person he could be talking about, and that one possible person was just in the situation that he's describing in his general vague, description. And people would call him out, and he sometimes he'd respond, I didn't have anyone in particular in mind. It's just a lie. He's lying. He was the king of that kind of deception.
The way he did it. But you are one of the people who's had, I think, 2 debates with him on the floor of the General Assembly. I've only listened to one, and it was several years ago. But can you speak at all to Tim's life and legacy, especially as someone who has had to, go, kind of not really go to the ground with him, but debate him about things that.
The reason that Ligon Duncan debated him is because Tim Keller was like the figurehead, the leader of the more liberal, progressive side of the PCA, and so that's the thing. And so Ligon Duncan, he was more of the representative and one of the leaders on the conservative side of the PCA. So if you want to understand how far the PCA has fallen, Ligon Duncan was the conservative at that time. And in some ways he still is, but woke church Ligon Duncan is a conservative, allegedly. Very interesting when you look at it from that perspective. Ligon Duncan was the polar opposite on some of the more contentious issues when it came to the liberals versus conservatives in the PCA. Let that sink in. Woke church Ligon Duncan.
That you disagreed on.
Right. Now the commercial space.
These
Wow,
commercials.
this is great. What you said about financing and tax implications.
I don't care about that.
I'm a late comer to Tim. Though we had occupied the same, tiny, our little corner of the Shire.
Yeah, that's right.
The PCA we're tiny compared to the Southern Baptist world or the larger evangelical world. We had occupied the same territory, but Tim's about 10 years older than me, and it was that first debate on women deacons and deaconesses that brought us together. And I've always in life, I would rather have a debate over things that I deeply care about and disagree upon with a friend rather than someone that I don't like.
Yeah.
And so it was
That's always true. That's always true. And I think that, so we talked about this in the last episode about the cross-politic interview with Clavin. I think that's something that cross-politic is really good at. They're really good at making friends and building bridges, despite what you're about to hear in this video, where if you listen to what he says, they're like the most, honorary and unfriendly people around. That's just not the case. It's just false. And So cross-politic builds bridges, they make friends, and they make friends with people that they deeply disagree with, and they try to be very charitable about how they hear those disagreements, and they try to find areas where they kind of agree, but maybe they need to change, nuance things a little bit and stuff like that. Who doesn't want to have an argument more with a friend than with someone that they don't like? In fact, there are people that I would not personally debate because I deeply dislike them so much that I wouldn't trust myself in a debate like that. A man's got to know his limits, right? But yeah, that's a very good thing to say, Ligon. Good work.
Blessing to be able to have that conversation with Tim. And
but he kind of didn't debate you, right? He showed up and then he was like,
that's Tim's way, right?
Yeah.
That's Tim's way. I mean, Tim doesn't like to be polemical. That was just never. He did. Tim.
Well, that's not really true. That's not really true. Because I seem to remember many articles in national publications, non-Christian publications, where Tim Keller absolutely ripped regular people in the pews, because they voted for Trump and they're racist and they're backwards and stuff like that. So Tim doesn't really mind being polemical so long as his opponent is just a regular peon. But if he's a stately, leader of the evangelical movement, okay, maybe that's how he feels. I don't really know because I don't really know Tim Keller that well. But he had no problem ripping the people in the pews. And this is one of my biggest problems with Big Eva in general, because they do the opposite of what Jesus did. The opposite. It's upside down. It's inversion. You see, what Jesus did was he would rip apart not evangelical leaders, the religious leaders of the Jews, right? He would rip them to shreds. And then if you see him interact with people who he disagrees with that are regular people, there's a lot more sympathy. There's a lot more, calm, criticisms. There's a lot more measured words, right, with the regular peons, right? That's Jesus' example. That's the example I try to follow as well. Of course, I do it imperfectly. But if you look at evangelicals leaders, they're actually inverted there. They rip apart regular peons in the pews. Oh, yeah, they're just, backwards, hillbillies, deplorable, all this kind of stuff. That's the impression you get when they write for The Atlantic. And then they soft pedal people they disagree with that are in their little guild. They're in their little club. That's always how it works with Big Eva. It's just the inversion of the example of Jesus Christ. So for all their talk about being Christ-like and kind, their talk is okay, so that's good. You can listen to their talk, just like the Pharisees. What they taught was okay, for the most part, but their example is inverted. Do what they say, don't do what they do, because they don't know what they don't embody what they do. And by the way, I think this is part of why Moscow gets dragged through the mud so much. Because Moscow actually does what they say they want to do. They want charity towards people. They want to be winsome in the good way. They want to build bridges and make friends, and they do, with people they disagree with. And so Moscow's existence and the way that Moscow operates is an absolute. It's such a contrast with what Standard Big Eva does. Standard Big Eva teaches the right way. They don't do the right things. Moscow teaches the right way and does the right things. And I think that really, really kind of chaps their, behinds, grinds their gears, because they see Moscow and they're like, oh, look at them. They lob bombs sometimes. Like, it's just like so ungracious. And they see them actually being gracious, right? They don't talk about, winsomeness all the time like these guys do, but they actually are winsome. That must really, really get their goat.
Posture was always apologetic and evangelistic. He was always trying to make a case for the gospel. Mm-hmm. He was trying to strip away objections to the gospel and to Christianity, and he was trying to reach out and persuade. And he was an evangelist at his heart.
He really was, yeah.
And so he was really uncomfortable in polemical settings.
Yeah.
Now, he had strong opinions and well-founded opinions, and I actually enjoyed arguing with him in private more than in public, because he didn't, when you're in public and you're a person of his stature, everybody is listening for every nuance of what you say, and they'll have a read on whatever you say, however you say it. When you're in private, you don't have to be careful that way. And so, I've been in a room with Al Mohler, Mark Dever, Tim Keller, and me, and unbelievably candid interactions.
Yeah, right.
And that was super enjoyable.
Yeah.
From a debate standpoint, more enjoyable than being in a public setting. But what was, just like the first time I met Vern Poythress at Westminster Seminary, unbelievably smart guy, but you meet Vern and you immediately love him. He loves Jesus, he loves the Bible, and you just love the man. Well, same thing with Tim. You meet Tim, and you talk to him for a little bit, and I love this man.
Yeah.
I love the way he loves Christ. When you learn his story, and I do think Colin really helped a lot of people come into, that's where that comes from in Tim. That's where that comes from in Tim. That's where that comes from in Tim. And I knew a little of that because my wife went to Gordon Conwell a little bit after Tim, but she had the same theological experience at Gordon Conwell that Tim and Kathy did. And so I used to tell people, if you want to understand Tim, you have to understand Gordon Conwell 1975. It's just everything, whether it's Loveless on dynamics of the spiritual life, or whether, I can go down the list of the people, and of course, especially Meredith Kline, that had a huge impact on Tim. But so it was really good to be put in that setting, because I think people thought that we were going to come out, with guns blazing and fisticuffs and all of that. And we had a really good, enjoyable engagement that I think was clarifying, and it ended up being unifying for the denomination. And then we had several other public engagements like that. But I tell you, one of the great blessings has been the last 7 years, I've taught Introduction to Pastoral and Theological Studies in New York City with Tim. So next week, I will teach it without Tim for the first time in 7 years. So it's a really poignant thing for me. And I'm actually, this will surprise some people on this call, whereas Tim started when we were teaching
a lot of people are noticing just Sean DeMars's interview style. And I'm not the best interviewer myself, so this criticism is about myself as well. But it's just like his interview style is like, ooh, ah, ooh, tss, ooh. Like it's just very annoying. I do that too, though. I think I do that too. That's why I don't do interviews on my show, because I'm not very good at it.
Course, doing a lot of his cultural engagement stuff up front. He realized after the first group of students that most of our students were basically unfamiliar with Reformed soteriology. So what Tim, he'd put all these cultural engagement stuff aside, and his one agenda in his lecture hours was to convince them of Reformed soteriology.
Wow.
And he also did a lot of stuff on call to the ministry that was helpful too. But there are a lot of people out there that I think would surprise them. You know,
he set aside contextualization.
Sets aside contextualization to go after Calvinism
to make sure you understand grace.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
that's exactly right. And so that was fun to be able to see him do that.
That doesn't surprise me at all, to be honest. But it's so interesting how they kind of know that contextualization stuff was no bueno. And it would have been nice to hear, more about why they have that opinion, because I agree. I remember, in fact, that's the very first lecture I heard, because I went to his church, of course, and then he also had this city for city or some kind of lecture series that was offered in New York, and I went to it. The very first one I heard was about contextualization, gospel contextualization. And even as a young Christian, I didn't know any better really, and so I was just listening, and I had no opinions really. But I remember thinking that doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound right. But at the time, I was just kind of like, well, I mean, I must be wrong because I'm new at this. I don't know what I'm talking about. But it never ever sat right with me. It certainly seemed like adjusting the message to reach your audience. And there's some truth there in the sense of maybe you adjust your tactics, or maybe you adjust your the kinds of wording that you use, or the tone of the words that you use, maybe, but it still has to have the same content, right? So sin can't become an offense against God, or start as an offense against God to not God's best for you. That's not contextualization. That's changing the content. Anyway, so yeah, even as a young Christian, I knew that didn't sound right, but I didn't really have the categories to talk about it.
And to watch how he did that and how he handled objections, and that was one of the great privileges, because I would sit in on his classes, and he was a master teacher. He remembered everything that he had ever read. I've had a few professors like that in my life. Tim's got that same thing.
Yeah.
I had a professor in Edinburgh who remembered things that he had read 50 years ago. He could tell you exactly where they were on the page.
Yeah.
He would get a paragraph quote almost exactly right. That's how Tim is. And so though Tim had never done a PhD, he had that kind of mojo for an academic, because of his memory and because of his intelligence. And he was interested in everything. He was always saying, hey, have you read? Have you read? Have you read? And he was reading so widely. He was reading stuff that I hadn't read.
Yeah.
And so he'd say, oh, you need to read this. You need to read this. And so that was fun. And we interacted a lot, text, email, phone calls, over the last 4 or 5 years of his life, and that was a special privilege. And he had admonitions for me along the way. Like when he knew things were going downhill with the cancer, he said to me over a year ago, he said, "Lig, how old are you?" And I think at the time I was 61 or 62, and he said,
"Wait, it's Lig? I thought it was Lig." Lig, how old are you? Lig, how old are you? Yeah, man, I must have been saying that wrong this whole time.
Don't think that you have time.
Oh, wow.
And that was a really good, and I'm not a person who takes for granted the time that the Lord has given me, but that was a really good admonition to have from Tim. So I got to be a little bit of a part of his life in that way. That was a wonderful friendship. And though I'm, in the PCA, people would associate me with the more confessional wing of the PCA. Tim and I had the most delightful working relationship, and we're totally on the same page with what we were trying to do with our students in New York City.
Wow, praise God. Switching gears a little, classical theism. That's the argument we're having these days.
Yeah.
Where do you land on that?
Yeah, I'm thankful for that. In the 1970s and 80s, because the big thing was just the battle for the Bible. So the doctrine of special revelation was a front burner issue. It was not uncommon for evangelicals to question all kinds of historic commitments to the Christian doctrine of God that Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestants would have all agreed upon up until the
There's a reason we're going through this, and I'm not commenting too much because I think Ligon has a lot of good things to say. You know what I mean? And I think that it's strategic to talk about all these things, which are not really softballs, but things that he could knock out of the park. You know what I mean? Because no one's gonna challenge him on his friendship with Tim Keller. But they talk about that first, because what they are attempting to set up here, and it's really genius. It's ingenious that they do it this way. But they're trying to set up a contrast, and so they're taking the first 30, 40 minutes to try to set up a contrast with what the real topic is, and the real topic is to lie about Moscow, to lie about Doug Wilson and his friends. And that's the point of this episode. Even if you look at how it's titled, Thoughts on Theonomy and Christian Engagement with Culture. That's the topic. And so all this stuff about Tim Keller and their charitable disagreements, and how Tim Keller was just this amazing man, and he was just so winsome, and he was an evangelist at heart, and all of this stuff, right? And by the way, he was totally orthodox. You notice how they threw that in there. He put aside his cultural engagement to focus just on Reformed theology. All of this stuff has been planned out. You need to understand, this is all pre-planned. Big Eva doesn't do off-the-cuff remarks. That's just not how it works, right? And even if you notice, later in this episode, he's going to say that, there's no such thing as Big Eva. That's crazy. Wait, what? And then he's going to say, oh, by the way, Kevin, sent me the rough draft of his attack against Moscow, and I, gave him my thoughts and approved it. And it's like, it's just so crazy. They don't do anything off the cuff, right? They don't do what I'm doing. What I do is I load this up. I have no notes, and I just off the cuff give you my opinion, which there's some downsides to that, because there's some things that I don't thoroughly research, and there's some things that I don't know. So I'll just be like, I don't know, I'll give you my opinion, stuff like that. They don't do this kind of thing. It's all planned out. So this might be boring to you, but this is all part of the setup. They're setting up a contrast. How great is Tim Keller and Ligon Duncan? And let me show you how terrible Doug Wilson is. And it's all based on lies, and it's all based on a false standard. Because as great as you think Tim Keller was, he is not the standard. I don't know what else to say, but that's the whole reason they're doing this. This is all setting up the stage for them to go in on Doug Wilson and lie many times in the process. It's all about deception. They're trying to deceive. And so that's what's going on here. The topic is Doug Wilson and Christian nationalists and theonomists. That's the topic. And this is all preliminary setup so that they can create this fake contrast to show you how evil all those people are. After all, these guys are just all about, they don't even talk about Reformed theology. They intend to drive people away from the gospel to talk about their cultural engagement. That's what he's trying to set up here. Because I don't think they're lying about Keller. He cared about Reformed theology, but he cared deeply about his phony baloney and awful upside down cultural engagement. He cared deeply about it. And that's his legacy. That's how his life ended up. That's where he was focused. but they're trying to pretend like, it wasn't that big. That contextualization, it wasn't a big deal. Yeah, I mean, I guess.
18th century.
Sure.
But the 20th century, you had people jettisoning the doctrine of divine simplicity, divine impassibility, immutability. I can go down the list of things that relatively solid evangelicals had thrown out the window.
Sure.
And so the recovery of a robust, historic, and biblical Christian doctrine of God, call it classical theism or whatever else, is a wonderful, wonderful thing.
Yeah.
And I've told Scott, my president at RTS Orlando has been a big part of that. He's a Trinitarian theologian, has written in that Zondervan series of
Scott
short
Swain?
Scott Swain
Yeah.
short introduction on the Trinity.
Yeah.
I told Scott, Scott, you have made me go back and think about how I've said things in my Doctrine of God course.
Yeah.
Things that I've said for 30 years that I've wanted to try, because of the insights that you have given to me, I've wanted to tighten up what I was doing. I always had, because I was confessional, I was protected against some of the newfangled trends that were out there. Like I know, the people that were jettisoning impassibility, I never bought that because I knew I couldn't buy that. That's not confessional. It's not a historic Christian approach to God. But the work of these younger guys, and they're everywhere. They're in the Baptist world, they're in the Presbyterian world, they're in the Anglican world, conservative, Bible-believing guys, recovering historic Christian doctrine, especially in the doctrine of God. They've really helped me, and I think set us on a good course.
The reformers were pretty harsh on scholasticism. Some of the guys in this classical theism conversation are more friendly towards scholasticism.
Yeah.
Do you think that's just because of how kind of scarred, wounded the reformers were because of the way scholasticism had run amok in the Roman Catholic Church?
You will find a mixed report in the reformers on the scholastics, and it depends on which scholastic you're talking about.
True.
So, Luther for sure was completely fried with late medieval nominalism. And look, I would have been too. I'd have been over in the corner cheering, "Go, Luther, go."
Yeah.
So, the late medieval nominalists come in for a lot of pounding from both the Lutheran and the Reformed. That's still going on today. But there are also scholastic theologians who the reformers, the first generation reformers, quoted with approbation, and so Calvin was not trained in a classical theological curriculum. He was a humanist trained. I mean, his dissertation was on Seneca's thesis on clemency. He had been prepared for law and then went in a different direction. He does not, in the way that a Petrus van Maastricht or a Francis Turretin or someone like that cite the scholastics and such. But you can find Calvin citing scholastic opinion in an approving way and then slapping around the schoolmen in other areas. And you can find a little bit of that in just about all of the reformers. So it was not necessarily a wholesale rejection of everything. I remember R.C. Sproul, I was doing this conference on the Westminster Confession before PCA General Assemblies back in the 1990s, early 2000s, and I invited R.C. to give a lecture on the Westminster Doctrine of God. And he got up, and his first sentence was something like this: "There is nothing unique about the doctrine of God in magisterial Reformed Protestantism in the 16th century in relation to Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. But the most unique thing about magisterial Protestantism in the 16th century was its doctrine of God." And that was such an RC way to start a lecture.
Yeah.
And then he went on to argue that what the reformers had done is that they had worked out the doctrine of God in relation to all the other loci of theology.
Okay.
So that the sovereignty of God permeated the totality of your theology, not just this little area of the doctrine of God and the Trinity. And of course, that especially applies to soteriology, you know. And but it also applied to things like ecclesiology. And so in an interesting way, RC kind of anticipated what has happened in the last 5-10 years amongst all these young guys.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
One of the things that I did not know that I learned from Colin Hansen.
Fascinating. Oh man, I'm making fun of you, Sean, but you know, again, this criticism goes to me as well. That's how I interview. It's not
biography
good.
of Keller was the connection of Keller and RC out
Yes.
at what was the name of the place where they were?
The Ligonier. Study
the
Center.
original Ligonier Study
in
Center.
Pennsylvania.
Before it was in Florida. Yeah. Brother, this is not meant to be like.
All right, so this is where they jump into the Moscow stuff. And we're going to stop here because I did cover this already. I'm going to cover it again. That's how weaselly and deceptive this part is. We're going to cover it twice. But I did want you to see that. I hope this wasn't like the most boring episode ever. I mean, it probably was for some of you. But I really need you to see how they set up the discussion of the Moscow mood. This was all intentional, and it's all for the purposes of deception. It's all to prop up the typical Big Eva, names that you all well know, and to make them see, they weren't quite as bad as people say. They were focused on the right stuff, the important stuff, and they interacted so graciously, and this and that, and it's all just to set up this false witness that they bear against Moscow and Doug Wilson, and it's all very self-serving. It's all intended to prop up the failure of Big Eva, the failure of guys like Tim Keller, the failure that Ligon Duncan is still participating in to this very day. It's all intended to set that up. And so, I don't want you to ever think that anything Big Eva does is not is off the cuff. It's all intentional. It's all plotted. It's all planned. It's all circulated. It's all reviewed and edited to have the most possible effect that they could possibly have. They are very conniving. Ligon Duncan is a very conniving man. Sean DeMars looks like he's participating in this, but who knows? He's a low-level goon. Who knows how much he's in the planning, but he's a willing participant. In any case, that's it for today. I hope you found this video helpful. God bless.
Mi alma.